Hello and welcome to the NeoSystems Big Picture Cyber Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our continuing series of Cybersecurity Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions. My guest today, Michael McLaughlin. I do want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Also on the line is our sketch-note artist, Wade Forbes. He's going to be making a visual record of the conversation, and we'll share that with everyone after the session is over today. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is federal government contractors. That's primarily who we have in our audience today. So thank you for joining. And if you do have some questions, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll work those into my conversation with Mike. I'll start with an introduction. Lieutenant Commander Michael McLaughlin is the Chief of Counterintelligence and Human Intelligence within U.S. Cyber Command's Cyber National Mission Force at Fort Meade, Maryland. He's held various positions within U.S. Cyber Command, graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy, and is currently a JD candidate at the University of Maryland. Mike's background is military intelligence and counterintelligence, specifically in the cyber domain. I do want to give a disclaimer that Mike is speaking with us today in a personal capacity, and the views he's expressing or will express do not necessarily represent those of U.S. Cyber Command or the Department of Defense. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you joined us just a couple months back, and we had some sort of unfinished business, some topics that we were not quite able to get to in our 30-minute format. So thanks for coming back. Before we continue down that thread, I do want to circle back a little bit to the discussion we had in March about Russia-Ukraine conflict and the potential for some spillover cyber damage that might affect us here in the U.S. The basic message was increased vigilance is necessary and warranted. We've heard that reinforced by the government in many ways over the past few weeks. Any updates on that front that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I think vigilance remains critical. Look, around the world, people are reacting with outrage and disgust to the Russian atrocities in Bucha and Mariupol and in other parts of Ukraine. And for many, there's this feeling of helplessness. But what we've seen for some, the reaction's been a lot more pointed. And since Russia began amassing forces along the Ukrainian border, we've seen a surge of hacktivists and lone cyber actors from across the globe taking matters into their own hands. Groups like Anonymous and the Belarusian cyber partisans, Ukrainian IT army, these are all groups who are actively targeting Russian organizations. I mean, in the last 2 months alone, you had a group, the Distributed Denial of Secrets, which is kind of similar to WikiLeaks in a lot of ways, but they've dumped over 6 million files that have been pilfered from Russian organizations onto the open web. And to put that into perspective, Distributed Denial of Secrets put out 6 million files in 2 months. In the first 10 years of its existence, WikiLeaks has only put out 10 million files. So it's a significant increase. And we in general, across cybersecurity community, across the government, we continue to monitor closely for Russian state-sponsored aggression in cyberspace. But I think everybody really also needs to be keenly aware that these new threats that are manifesting themselves in this conflict, they are substantial and they're going to remain with us. And right now, we're the vast majority of us are cheering on these activist groups they're just teeing off against the Russians. But crowdsourcing of cyber warfare is really setting a dangerous precedent that could have some pretty significant ramifications into the future. So vigilance, I think, is going to remain key.
So you talked when we talked previously about ransomware as kind of gray zone warfare. And I think we got a really good example of that with this Conti Leaks publication. So it's a Ukrainian group that published stuff on the Conti ransomware gang. And, we already knew that Conti was pretty evil and they were pretty good at the extortion game. But, these leaks that have come, this is a Ukrainian source. Conti backs Russia and they publicly stated that. So the Ukrainian source, leaked all the material. That gives us a really clear picture of what I'll call kind of the corporate nature of their operations. I mean, it just really seemed like it looks like a pretty mature enterprise that's going on there. What lessons should we take away from all this intelligence that's out there? That and all these other records that you mentioned of new information we have at our fingertips now.
Right. I think some of the most fascinating insights about ransomware as a service and that entire ecosystem have come to light as a result of Conti leaks. We've learned a really tremendous amount about both the decentralized nature of that group and about ransomware as a service in general. But we've seen a lot about learned a lot about the formal hierarchy within the ranks of Conti, within the ranks of these other groups. The amorphous nature of Conti in particular, similar to a lot of the ransomware as a service groups, they make it really challenging for governments to effectively characterize these activities. Conti leaks revealed at least some of the connection between Conti and the Russian Federal Security Service, which is one of the successor organizations to the KGB. But that connection is really tenuous at best. And it's a connection that was identified by Bellingcat between individual members of Conti and the Russian FSB. Now, that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of control over the group that would enable us to hold Russia, or really any nation for that matter, responsible for the actions of that ransomware group of Conti. This really makes eradicating the problem under international law and under the international legal rubric we currently have incredibly difficult. Unfortunately, what Conti Leaks is showing us is that our options when it comes to ransomware is to either rely on countries in which these individuals are operating to dismantle them, which, for the vast majority of ransomware actors is Russia, or to harden our networks and develop a culture of resiliency. For obvious reasons, I don't think we can rely on Russia to do that on our behalf. So we really need to look at reducing the economic incentives for the ransomware groups and make it as difficult as possible, and really make it as difficult as possible with them to conduct their operations. We need to make it harder. We need to have backups, and so we don't have to pay up. So we can disincentivize what they're doing.
So the insight that we're gaining, does that help us defend better? You mentioned backups, but they've moved to a double extortion scheme. So now they're, doing wall of shame stuff where they threaten to publish the data if you don't pay the ransom. So even having a backup doesn't solve the problem, right? If you can't stop exfiltration, then you still could be a victim.
No, and that's a really great point. And I think what we're learning is that understanding the business model is incredibly important. Ransomware as a service really gives less sophisticated actors access to tools that would otherwise be unavailable to them. I think the focus for us and in general, in businesses and those of us in the cybersecurity world, we need to really harden that first mile. We need to enforce, non-SMS based multi-factor authentication, for example. But we need to try to make these ransomware groups or ransomware actors look elsewhere to make it not worth their time. Look, if a nation state wants to target your network, it will, and they're going to get it. A nation has unlimited time and resources. Ransomware groups are looking to make as much money as fast as possible in as short a time as possible. And to them, it's a business. And so if we can make it even just a little bit harder for these groups, they're going to look somewhere else. And so focusing on that first mile, I think, is critical. And then certainly the resilience aspect. You need to be able to come back and return to business as normal with as little downtime as possible. And so if that means segmenting your network so that your most sensitive data, the data that you don't want to be exfiltrated for that double and triple extortion, then that's what you need to do. And it comes down to identifying what your risk is and building a resilient structure around it.
I want to riff off your comment about giving sort of less sophisticated actors access to things they might not have. So Lapsus Group, recently had several of its principals arrested. These are teenagers, essentially, most of them, and they so not a sophisticated enterprise, not organized crime per se, but they were able to break into, before they got arrested, they were able to break into T-Mobile, Microsoft, NVIDIA. These are big name targets that they were able to take down pretty easily. Arrests we were able to find these folks and arrest them. That's not the norm, though, right? Some of these other groups, we're not arresting them en masse. How does the legal framework play in terms of our ability to go in and stop this? Why were we able to take down Lapsus in that way, but maybe not some of these others?
So this really goes to where they're located. The Lapsus Group was, as you described, it was comprised of these UK-based teenagers. And fortunately for us, and really fortunately for the world, the UK operates by the rule of law. And unfortunately, the vast majority of ransomware actors intentionally operate from countries that won't enforce criminal liability against these groups. There just aren't legal remedies for the latter group of actors. International law is generally inapplicable to non-state actors, and only US federal law reaches countries willing to extradite those actors. So it's not to say indictments are never going to work or that they're ineffective. I think quite to the contrary. I think indictments are effective, but only to a point. For Russian actors, indictments effectively create a lifelong ban on traveling outside of Russia. If we want to, if we need to reinforce that ban, we need to find other ways. And parts of the government are doing that. You've got the Department of State has a program called the Rewards for Justice program, and it's currently offering up to $10 million for information leading to the arrest of certain malicious cyber actors. So if you're an indicted actor in Russia and there's now a bounty on your head, anytime you leave Russia, you're looking over your shoulder. You're going to think twice. This does have a deterrent effect. It's just not going to be the immediate effect that we're really looking for. It's not going to be that immediate effect that we are going to get the indictment and then immediately get an arrest like we did with Lapsus. It's more of a long-term deterrent strategy.
Got it. So one more question about Lapsus. I mean, one of the things that I noted as I was kind of reading through some of the takedown was how easy they had buying access credentials, right? They were able to buy credentials for these target companies just at will. These are user IDs and passwords. Then their next challenge is getting past the multi-factor authentication. So they had to worry about device enrollment, getting a device that they controlled set up to receive the MFA codes. And so they use social engineering of the employees. These are large targets. So there's tens of thousands of employees. You only need one really to do that. To get access to a VPN or something, and then they're inside the network with a lot of trust. How do we defend against that? Is it zero trust? Is it changing? You mentioned earlier getting MFA off of SMS so that things like SIM swapping that Lapsus was doing wouldn't work as well. Like what are our best defenses against the kind of attack structure that they were using?
Yeah, this is one of the challenges that so many professionals in the security community ignore. And certainly, the buzzwords that we have with zero trust. Zero trust is a great methodology. It's a great model, and it's something that we certainly need to move towards. But it's not the only solution, and really, it's only one solution. I've heard it said many times, the biggest threat to any network is between the chair and the keyboard. And it really couldn't be more true. Humans are inherently the weakest link when it comes to security. My background's in counterintelligence. And so within the DoD, we're actively hunting for insider threats. We're looking for indicators of espionage, both within our vendor base and in our employees. And we're looking for social engineering that's targeting those same people. Where the vast majority of companies have almost zero insight is the way in which social media is used to target its employees. Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, I mean, take your pick of social media, but these companies need to recognize that personal accounts are part of your attack surface. And malicious actors and everything from criminal groups, from Nigerian princes to ransomware actors, all the way up to foreign intelligence services. These actors are using social media to target and exploit people and networks all over the world. And this can come in the form of harvesting information to gain your confidence for social engineering. I mean, you can get onto social media, you can figure out what somebody likes, what they dislike, what their interests are. And it's, I can message somebody on Facebook and say, hey, you like cats? Well, I love cats. Here's some funny pictures of cats. Click this link. And that sounds like a joke, but it really is that easy. And people overshare on social media and they let their guard down. Now, normally that wouldn't necessarily be a huge concern, but in the wake of COVID, network perimeters effectively evaporated. And now we have this endless web of home routers and personal devices. And social media has really become this a significant vector of compromise. Now, there are a lot of vendors that focus on traditional security. Unfortunately, there are very few that actually focus on social media protection. And there are a couple. One, Safeguard Cyber in Charlottesville is one that comes to mind. But there are a couple that do. But ultimately, social media protection, it's a cultural problem. We need to train employees not to share everything on social media. We need to train people to be skeptical of engaging with people on social media in the same way as they would be in the real world. And depending on the value of the data that's on your network, sometimes it's necessary to ban social media on corporate networks, and also bring your own devices. Sometimes it's more challenging than others, but it's going to come down to the risk that a company is willing to take.
And you mentioned the company's responsibility versus the employees, for things like social media presence and personal accounts and things like that. One of the analysis pieces I was reading on Lapsus suggested that companies might want to buy stolen credentials from dark web vendors, meaning not just maybe their credentials for their networks, but if their employees had compromised some of their personal credentials, maybe they buy those as well, just to keep them out of the wrong hands, right? Once they've been sold, the vendors got their money, they're off the market. What's your reaction to that? Is that a reasonable thing for companies to do? Go out there and, sort of clean up after their employees, if you will?
Yeah, quite frankly, I think that's a misguided notion. There's no honor amongst thieves. I'm incredibly reluctant to entrust my security in the belief that a dark web vendor isn't just going to take my money and then sell the credentials to the highest bidder anyway. And more than that, and so there's that. There's certainly the distrust that I have of dark web vendors. But more than that, I think by doing that, you're creating an even bigger marketplace for malicious actors to sell compromised credentials to dark web vendors. I mean, let's go through basic economics here. If companies start regularly purchasing their own stolen creds off the dark web, the price is inherently going to go up. If the price goes up, the vendors are going to be willing and able to pay more actors to compromise more credentials from a larger number of organizations. I mean, you can see how this actually would make cyberspace overall less secure, just as a whole. And so, in general, I'm not a big fan of engaging with these types of groups. And I think the best solution is to prevent the impact of compromised credentials in the first place. You can't control whether a website you use gets compromised, but you can control whether you use the same password for every account. And for individuals, I mean, you can use a password manager. For organizations, you can require multi-factor authentication, especially for things like VPN connections. I think that's really where we need to go, as opposed to trying to, reclaim lost credentials after they're already stolen.
So I've got an audience question I want to work in here, and this is kind of getting to the, how those of us on the defense side, how do we respond to this? So the path you were sort of going down. The question is regarding organizational resiliency. What potential collaboration with CISA do you see is possible as an evolution to their current free services provided to NCI, et cetera?
Yeah, I know CISA has a program called JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. I think I always mess up the last C, but it's effectively an information sharing mechanism. And so that's one aspect. For DIB companies in particular, you've got DICE, the DCISE, part of DC3 is your inject point for all voluntary reporting for sharing information with DoD if you're a DIB member. NSA, the Cybersecurity Directorate, has a similar information sharing program. And so there are a lot of options for sharing information, for sharing reports and reporting threats. The FBI has another option. But the bottom line is, if we want to resolve this problem, we need to work together. It can't just be whole of government, and it can't be just pushing down to the private sector and deferring to the network owners and the net defenders to secure themselves. Because in reality, we've got foreign governments, we've got foreign government-backed actors who are targeting our private sector. They are part of the battle space, and so the government and the private sector need to work together. I think there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration. I think there are a lot of opportunities for sharing information, and I think we need to capitalize on them.
Just saw an article that was talking about a North Korea-backed organization that was doing spear phishing campaigns targeting journalists. So, the other targets they mentioned were government officials, NGOs, academics, defectors from North Korea. These are all, you could pretty much guess those targets, but journalists, a little bit of a new category. I don't think they may think of themselves as being highly targeted. Why journalists?
Well, and I think it's really important to understand every adversary we have uses cyberspace in a bit of a different way, but it's always to achieve their own ends. Russia uses cyber capabilities to exert pressure on the international community through this, continuous campaign of hybrid warfare. China is using it to compromise intellectual property and for intellectual property theft and espionage. Iran's using it to destabilize its regional competitors and to more and more target Western interests. North Korea, by contrast, is using cyberspace as a tool to compensate for that which its regime lacks. And so we've seen it manifest itself, financially, where you've got the Lazarus Group targeting financial organizations and banks and Bitcoin wallets to try to fund North Korea's nuclear program. We've seen the North Korean regime and their cyber actors target, back in 2014, target Sony Pictures to try to prevent them from producing The Interview, which is a very funny movie, by the way. But that attack scared movie theaters to the point that many were unwilling to even show the film. And the goal of this was censorship. They didn't want a movie coming out that was going to be contrary to the Kim regime. So I think ultimately North Korea is targeting journalists for two reasons. The first, kind of like the attack on Sony, journalists who publish stories critical of North Korea and their sources, they pose a threat to the Kim regime. And by compromising journalists and targeting those sources, North Korea is seeking to quiet its critics. It's seeking to censor them. And I think it's, that's a pretty effective and pretty deterring factor. If you're compromising these journalists to the point that their sources are known, especially if their sources are inside North Korea, you're going to probably think twice about reaching out to a journalist. I think the second reason is intelligence collection. Unlike our more advanced adversaries, North Korea's intelligence apparatus is limited in its capability. Journalists inherently, they're kind of like human collectors. They offer a wealth of information on all sorts of topics, foreign relations, North Korean dissidents, foreign military capabilities, all sorts of information. But it's information that I think would be otherwise unaccessible or inaccessible to the regime. And so they're going to be targeted because it's a way for the regime to compensate for that which it lacks.
And I would presume that that's the kind of attack where, once you compromise a journalist, you keep that real quiet and just watch, listen for a long period of time, right? Maybe long-term exfiltration. You mentioned the sources, and I think that's, the sort of indirect attack, right? They attack the journalist, not maybe for what the journalist knows, but to understand their sources and what they know and maybe get access to them. The other place we've seen that is with service providers. We've seen state-sponsored actors conducting large-scale systemic brute force exploitation of the cloud provider practices and managed service provider practices. So if they're configuring something wrong, they're probably configuring it wrong for all their clients. So if you can crack that, you may get access to a large number of targets. So it's really the downstream companies, not the service provider, that's the ultimate target. And given that a great many in the defense industrial base, especially the small business that rely on external service providers for cloud computing, managed services, do you think there should be a shift? Should we shift our defensive focus over to the service providers? Are they really where we should be focusing rather than individual DIB members?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question. This is something that the federal government is moving towards as a result of the executive order for cybersecurity. The bottom line is this: any cloud service provider, any cloud-based service in general, it's only going to be as secure as the company that's managing it. I think in theory, the benefits for individual companies using cloud services outweigh the risks. I mean, if you are a small to medium-sized business and you are required to secure your own network, the chances of you being able to do it to the degree and to the quality that a Microsoft or an Oracle or an AWS is able to is pretty low. But then again, I mean, as I continue to harp on this, but if a nation state wants to compromise a network, it's got unlimited time, it's got unlimited resources, and it's going to do it. And so when we centralize data from a lot of different companies into a single location, it's inevitably going to become a target. I think the key is to understand the risk and select a reputable cloud computing and managed service provider that's going to be able to give those services to you in a secure way. The challenge we run into is trying to centralize all of the DIB or centralize all of these different companies into just a handful of service providers. And so right now there really are only a handful of, and I named most of them: Microsoft, Microsoft Azure, or Amazon AWS, Oracle, Google Cloud. But if all we're doing is focusing on these a handful of cloud-based vendors, I think we are doing a disservice. So I think there is good and bad, and I think it's a challenge. But ultimately, it's a risk that we are running by operating this model.
And wrapped around those few big players are thousands of smaller MSPs that are managing those cloud environments on behalf of their customers. and so that there's things going on there, configuration choices, hardening choices, monitoring choices.
Absolutely.
That are really independent of what the cloud service provider is doing. David McCune, the CISO for DoD, he made some comments at an AFCEA conference last week, and he was promoting the concept where DoD would certify, that was the word he used, certify service provider offerings as a way to avoid the need to go out and assess every network in the DIB. And it sounds like a shift, that sounds like a shift towards let's focus our limited assessment capability on the service providers rather than the end consumer organizations. I mean, we certainly subscribe to that thinking as an MSP where we, first of all, we need to make sure that what we're doing is very secure. We're doing it for all of our clients. And, we would like to have some vetting of that, so that having the government vet that out helps distinguish those who are taking it seriously from those who are not. Is this, in your mind, is this a force multiplier? Is this something that we should be pursuing?
Yeah, and I am a huge, huge proponent of leveraging the incredible capability of the U.S. cybersecurity industry to better secure the DIB. Dave's concept echoes a project that actually I worked on with the Applied Research Lab for Intel and Security. Meet their contractual requirements and to achieve compliance under CMMC, but also to rapidly share information and threat indicators across the DIB and with the federal government. I think this is a concept that's absolutely a force multiplier, and one I'm pushing for the DoD to implement. I mean, there really are myriad benefits for this. First and foremost, if you have a marketplace of cybersecurity vendors that are vetted and certified by the DoD to service DIB companies, that's going to ensure that DIB companies are able to meet their requirements under the CMMC. It's going to make sure that they at least have that baseline because the DoD is certifying the cybersecurity company to provide that. But what you're also doing is you're creating an environment in which cybersecurity vendors are able to consolidate a lot of data, a lot of threat data in particular, in one location that they can then share back with the federal government, so the government can apply all of its resources, everything from CISA to the FBI to the NSA to Cyber Command, apply all of its resources in parsing through that data and find the trends and find the real risks, find the large scale threats that are facing this country. Because right now we just don't see it. And in 2021, General Nakasone testified to Congress, and I remember this distinctly, but he was asked about what he needed. And ultimately, the NSA, for obvious reasons, primarily the Fourth Amendment, isn't able to look and peer into domestic networks. And that is for good reason. But General Nakasone's comment was, look, we can't connect the dots. Not only can we not connect the dots, we can't see the dots. And we can't see them because we have legal limitations. And so I think this marketplace is one way in which we could rapidly share threats so that we can put all of the resources of our government to use in a way that the cybersecurity vendors are participating in a way that the companies are participating in, but also in a way that is protecting the privacy of U.S. persons.
Very good. I want to work in one quick audience question, and then I'll ask a kind of a closer question. This audience member asks, do you foresee this sort of DoD managed service provider validation and certification as a pathway to more easily enable CATO or continuous ATO across the DIB?
I do. Well, I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm very interested to see in the way in which it's implemented. My view of it is that it is certainly a way in which we could achieve continuous compliance in such a way that you wouldn't have individual companies trying to audit and trying to self-assess. And you certainly wouldn't be required to have third-party assessors because the companies themselves would be already vetted and validated. And so that assessment would go away. There would just be, I think it would allow us to achieve continuous compliance in a way that we're not able to do right now. And quite frankly, I don't think we're going to be able to do under CMMC 2.0.
And I'll say that just from a practical perspective, right? If you're going to do 70,000 assessments every 3 years, if you focused on 1,000 or a couple thousand service providers and did it every year, like would I as a service provider be willing to be audited once a year as opposed to every 3 years? Sure, why not? I do it anyway for SOC and FedRAMP and all that stuff, right? Would I be willing to submit continuous monitoring evidence. FedRAMP requires monthly submissions, so cloud providers are all doing it today. So I think that's something that, you could have a lot more interaction if you shrink the number of companies you're trying to do it on from the 300,000, of which 70,000, that those are huge numbers to swallow. And not saying stop doing another thing, but if more and more of those 3-year assessments were, I've got a contract with a service provider, they're certified, that obviously simplifies that assessment quite a bit, right?
Yeah. And Ed, for you, that's a profit area. For the vast majority of DIB companies, it's a cost area. It's a place that they are losing money. And for you, if we can work that into the contract and make it such a way that it's just inherently that you are, when you vie for a contract with the DoD, part of that contract is this managed cybersecurity provider. Well, then it's not a cost area anymore. Then a lot more companies are going to be able to enter the space.
Right. For us, it's table stakes.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me, we're kind of at the end of our time. Let me ask a quick closing question. Just want actionable advice to our audience. So senior executives, board members, what should they be thinking about and what action should they take today based on all the things we've just talked about?
Yeah, I think the geopolitical uncertainties that we're seeing across the board and the likelihood that these uncertainties are going to manifest themselves in cyber attacks, companies across every sector really need to maintain a heightened state of alert. We need to have vigilance. Really, we should be focused on hardening networks. And if you haven't already done so, now is the time. We got to apply patches, upgrade legacy systems and software, conduct pen testing, monitor your logs, enforce MFA, conduct employee training, back up your critical data. The list goes on, but ultimately you need to harden your network and you need to be prepared for whatever is going to come from the geopolitical unrest that we're seeing. For smaller companies, the laundry list of things that you need to do can really seem insurmountable at times. If you're unable to effectively do it, to harden your network and to monitor, start looking for a managed solution to do it for you. It's important we dispel the myth that any company is too small to be targeted. Every company can be targeted. Every company is on the battlefield.
Really excellent. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today and for your insights. Very much appreciated as always. Thanks, Wade, for the good job drawing things over there on the side, and thanks to the audience members for your time and attention and for the questions you sent in. I do want to thank you for joining us. Our next town hall session is going to be Wednesday, May 18th, so it's a couple weeks out. Wednesday, May 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Keep an eye on your inbox for the registration information. If you don't see that in there, then go to our website, neosystemscorp.com, where you can find all the details in the event section. Thanks, everyone.